Joining me now, Anthony Coley, MSNBC Justice and Legal Affairs Analyst, also former Senior Advisor and Chief Spokesperson for Attorney General Merrick Garland, along with Brendan Buck, MSNBC Political Analyst and former Press Secretary to House Speaker John Boehner. Welcome, gentlemen. Anthony, you first here. Republican Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have signaled they plan to oppose Matt Gaetz' nomination as Attorney General, at least for now. Meanwhile, you have House Speaker Mike Johnson, who says he is, quote, strongly against the release of a House ethics report on Gaetz. You've been speaking to career DOJ staff from both parties. Give me a sense of the reaction to Gaetz as potential AG.
Yeah, well, I think the term that comes to mind in my conversations is a train wreck, really, Alex. And I would also add here, I've been a chief spokesman for 3 U.S. senators, and the default position for most senators is to give incoming presidents the opportunity to make out their own batting order, to allow a president to put his own team in place, provided that those folks are qualified. And that's the rub here with this attorney general nominee. As far as we can tell, Alex, Matt Gaetz has never even argued a case in court. He has scant management experience. DOJ is a department with 115,000 employees, multiple bureaus and components. And Matt Gaetz has no national security experience, not anything meaningful, little antitrust experience. And he certainly has no experience with criminal law, except for being the target of a federal criminal investigation looking to inappropriate sexual contact, allegedly with a minor. So I think ultimately, Alex, this is a loyalty test for Senate Republicans. Will they join Senate Democrats to do what they know is right, and that is reject an unqualified nominee, or will they bow to what Donald Trump wants? And unfortunately, I think for all of us who promote and support the Constitution and the rule of law, I suspect that Senate Republicans are going to give Trump what he wants.
And I'm going to add to that, he also practiced law for less than 2 years. So the question to you then, Brendan, will Republican senators fall in line, or will they reject Gaetz? Could they, for example, torpedo his nomination, given the bipartisan outrage at him potentially leading the DOJ, but then confirm Trump's other questionable picks?
Well, I think he certainly does provide a level of cover for some of the other people like Pete Hegseth, who I think surprised a lot of people as well. I wouldn't want to be in Matt Gaetz's position, to say the least. He's obviously not coming in with a strong hand. I'm not ready, though, to say that Republicans are going to reject him. I could see Collins and I could see Murkowski voting against him. But I think you have to appreciate how many Republicans see what Donald Trump just did in this election and would be very concerned about crossing him. You've seen reports as many as 30 Republican senators are willing to vote against him, but that's all said in private. That's all said anonymously. You haven't seen a lot of people say that publicly. So I do think these will be, if he gets to this point, some of the most insane confirmation hearings we've ever seen. And the things that the House Ethics Committee has been looking into, whether or not that report comes out, are going to be front and center. Don't think that committee, Democrats on that committee, are just going to let that go if the report doesn't come out.
Hey, Brendan, do you not envy John Thune's position, Senate Majority Leader, having to oversee all this, given the heavy footprint of Donald Trump everywhere?
Well, look, I think John Thune's position, I think, is probably going to be clear. He's going to have to say that he's for him, but it's not John Thune's decision alone. Obviously, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are leading out there, but it's not hard to see a Mitch McConnell or a Todd Young or some of these other senators who have been critical of Donald Trump being the ones who sink this. The other obvious dynamic here is Donald Trump has raised this idea of going through recess appointments. So allow Congress to go out of session long enough where under the Constitution, he can just appoint whoever he wants. That feels unlikely to me, because that's the same vote. You have to affirmatively vote to go into recess in that way. And I don't know why, if there are a number of people who are blocking some of these confirmations, they're going to turn around and pretend like that vote to go into recess isn't the exact same thing. So I'm skeptical that that's going to play out. I think that the way that he gets a Matt Gaetz or some of these other people through is just by leaning on them. Pure Trump leverage politics, and see if he can get there. I'm not saying Matt Gaetz is going to get confirmed. I'm just saying we need to watch this closely. Matt Gaetz, this is another thing I want people to appreciate. Matt Gaetz, for all the things you guys just said, is not a dunce. He's actually a really smart and shrewd operator. He just kicked out the Speaker of the House and paid really no consequence for it. I think that's one thing that people should understand about him. He's in a lot of hot water. He's very immoral, but we need to not just assume that he's a roadkill at this point.
So, Anthony, Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin slammed Trump's DOJ picks overall because they also include his personal defense lawyers, Todd Blanche, John Sauer, as Deputy AG and Solicitor General, respectively. And Durbin said, quote, "These selections show Donald Trump intends to weaponize the Justice Department to seek vengeance." Donald Trump viewed the Justice Department as his personal law firm during his first term, and these selections, his personal attorneys, are poised to do his bidding. What kind of long-term damage can be done to the DOJ, if it is not an independent agency?
Right. Well, it's important to remember that the reason Donald Trump wants these individuals in these positions of high power is because they will do his bidding. Right now, the Justice Department, and it has a number of post-Watergate norms that the department and put in place over decades to prevent the department from being used for partisan political purposes. Right now, with these nominees, you have people in place who put politics before party. Right now, DOJ will tell you that they follow the facts and the law. The facts and the law tell them where to go next. That's not the case with Matt Gaetz. He, quite frankly, is going to be a puppet for Donald Trump. Going after Trump's perceived political enemies, regardless of what the facts say, regardless of what the rule of law says. For these two deputy positions, in many cases, they're even more dangerous because they have worked in the department before. They know how to navigate the structure. They know how to use the department and to weaponize the department for Trump's political ends. And I think that, quite frankly, Alex, should have all of us concerned, particularly not just Democrats, but all Americans who support the rule of law.
Brendan, the top requirement Trump looks for is loyalty. Time magazine reported that in his first term, Trump's aides and advisors were able to blunt his more extreme, his ill-advised decisions, noting, quote, "The degree to which Trump faced pushback from his own appointees was often a reflection of the extraordinary nature of his orders." With few guardrails or checks on power this time, will it be clear how the independence of these agencies is a norm rather than an explicitly written rule?
Yeah, there's something deeply unsettling about how these Trump people talk about loyalty. Look, it's normal to have the people who come into administration be loyal to the president. I assume most people who work in the White House are loyal to Joe Biden. But the issue that that they're looking at, and I think this is the point you're getting to, is they're talking about whether you're going to prioritize law, the Constitution, what's good for the country over what Donald Trump wants you to do, what is best for him personally. And that's what all of this is about. That's what Matt Gaetz going in as Attorney General is all about. He is a deep believer in this idea of the deep state, that there are people throughout the government who are undermining the president at every step. And what is Matt Gaetz' first priority going to be? To fire lots of people. It's not going to be to target political enemies. Maybe they'll get to that. It's going to be firing anybody they think that is going to get in the way of perhaps, I don't know, rounding up millions of people for deportation. That's the kind of thing they're talking about, pressing the limits. What are you willing to do? Who are you going to side with, Donald Trump or the law? And that's what they mean when they say loyalty.
Okay.
Alex, I think, let me jump in here. I think the word that they're really after here is obedience. They want somebody to do exactly what Donald Trump wants, regardless of what the facts and the law say. And that's very different from what we saw with Trump's first two attorney generals who were loyal, but they had lines that they would not cross. Bill Barr, for example, refused to go along with this lie that the election was stolen. And that's why we have a different mold of attorney general here. They don't want anyone whose fidelity is to the Constitution. They want someone whose absolute fidelity is to Donald Trump. They want somebody who's obedient.
Yeah, I think you just made the point that Brenda was making as well. It's gone from loyalty to obedience. All right, gentlemen, good to see you both. Thank you much.